entire world is watching the presidential election in Iran for
Today's other top story, what could be an historic opening with Iran.
With the U.S. and Iran on the brink.
Bloodshed in the streets of Iran.
The mass protests in Iran are showing no signs of ending.
This is Iran Uncovered, a podcast by Nufti. And in Washington, D.C., I'm your host, Cameron Consarinia. The political structure of the Islamic Republic in Iran is, for many, a mystery, or as Churchill said, a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. It presents itself as having some systemic components of other normal democratic states, including purported diplomats and charades it attempts to pass off as elections. Yet it maintains a massive murky cabal in which most real decisions are made. Many apologists in the West present it as being on par with Western democracies. Flawed, but moving forward. The Iranian people, however, seem to disagree. To find out more, we'll discuss it today with a veteran Iranian journalist. She's the publisher and editor of Kayhan London and Kayhan Life, and she was the London producer and chief correspondent for the Voice of America Persian service and moderated a bi-weekly roundtable discussion on Manoto television called This Week. She is a trustee of the Foreign Press Association in London and the Persian Educational Foundation, and she has served as the vice president and president of the Foreign Press Association in London and was a judge of the United Kingdom's Parliamentary Press Gallery Awards, presented to journalists considered to have made the greatest contribution internationally to the protection, promotion, and perpetuation of parliamentary democracy. She also co-edited the Foreign Policy Center's Iran Human Rights Review. She is a member of Chatham House and the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and she received her bachelor's from Washington University in Public Affairs and Government and her master's from Georgetown in International Relations and Comparative Politics. And she has worked with various international educational and philanthropic organizations. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by veteran Iranian journalist Nazenin Ansari. Nazenin, welcome to Iran Uncovered, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so very much, Cameron John, for inviting me to take part in your podcast.
It's a pleasure. We're really pleased to have you. As we said in the intro, oftentimes the Islamic Republic's political system is described in very many ways by many different people. I recently read it as being described as having, quote, a dual structure of Islamic and democratic values. Do you think that's right? Do you think Iranians see it that way?
This is a very good question, and to answer it, it's important to refer to the constitution that governs the Islamic Republic and sets its legal parameter and defines the political landscape wherein the political forces can compete. It's important to recall that the political factions who were involved in the 1979 revolutions were basically three groups. One were, of course, the religious clerics. Let's call them the Islamists, because they were not from the traditional wing of Islam, or what we had in Iran before the revolution. Then there were the communists, the Tudeh party, for example, and the Islamic Marxists in the guise of the Mujahideen Khalq. And finally, the Western educated revolutionaries, such as the current foreign minister, Javad Zarif, or Dr. Ali Akbar Salehi, who's the current head of the Atomic Energy Organizations. They were both educated in the West. So when it came to writing the Constitution and defining the landscape, these three forces have been actively involved. But at the end of the day, it is the Constitution that defines the landscape. The preamble of the Constitution states that the concept of the Islamic government is based on the governance of the jurisprudence, which is the Velayat-e Faqih, which was at that time, when it was first written, provided by Mr. Khomeini, Ayatollah Khomeini. According to the preamble, it says that with respect, and I quote, with respect to the Islamic content of the Iranian Revolution, which was a movement for the victory of the oppressed people over their oppressors, the Constitution prepares the ground for continuing this revolution at home and abroad. And it specifically strives to expand international relations with other Islamic movements and people in order to pave the way for the formation of a single universal community in accordance with the Quranic verse. Now, it also defines the country as administration and how it is administered according to the Quran and the traditions defined and interpreted by religious authorities. Consequently, what it says, and I quote, serious and meticulous supervision on the part of the Islamic scholars, fuqahay adil, which always refers to just men of religious law. And the objective of the government is to foster the human being in the direction of the divine order. Insofar as the citizens are concerned, there is no mention of popular sovereignty. Instead, sovereignty rests with the supreme leader, and it is based on the sovereignty of the command of God and continuous religious leadership, the imamat, and that this constitution prepares the background for the actual leadership of a qualified jurisprudent who is recognized as leader and recognized, not voted for, but recognized as leader by the people. To be as a leader by the people, and the administration of affairs should be by those scholars who are learned in regard to God and that which He has permitted and that which He has forbidden. In other words, citizens recognize rather than vote. So, if I may just continue, as far as the rights of the people are concerned, this goes into the chapter 3 of the Constitution, where each right that is given, it is then becomes conditional upon being in conformity with Islamic criteria as interpreted by in part the Islamic scholars.
So lots of reference to those Islamic values and principle, very little, if any, to democratic principles. But I guess this sort of starts immediately with the Islamic Revolution. Khomeini has this famous speech where he comes back and says, "Man dolat tayin mikonam." I mean, I will decide the government. I shall decide the structure. And what's so interesting in what you just referred to is the exportation of that government outside of Iran's physical borders. It's not just in the Islamic Republic's constitution, it would seem, something for Iran, rather something for the entire world. And we hear this frequently from leaders of the Islamic Republic, discussion of the ummat, not the millat, meaning the Islamic community, not the nation of Iran. So how important is the exportation of this ideology for this regime?
It is very important. Indeed, in the Constitution, once again, I go back to the Constitution, it describes an ideological army. Ideology is very important within this Constitution, and specifically in relation to the Islamic Revolutionary Guards. And what it says, again, I quote from it, in establishing and equipping the defense forces of the country, the focus shall be on maintaining ideology and faith as the foundation and the measure. And so, again, I quote, consequently, the army of the Islamic Republic and the Islamic Pasdaran Revolutionary Corps, that's the IRGC, are formed in accordance with this aforementioned objective. They will undertake the responsibility of not only guarding and protecting the borders, but also the weight of ideological mission, that is, striving for jihad on the path of God and struggle on the path of expanding the sovereignty of the law of God in the world. Again, it then refers to a Quranic verse.
Hmm.
So that is all it defined within the Constitution. I mean, for me, if I want to basically uh, decide whether it is democratic or not, I will go always to the Constitution of any country,
Sure.
because at the end of the day, it describes the nature of that political system.
No, absolutely. So, in order to achieve some of these goals that you just laid out within this constitutional framework, what sort of institutions has the Islamic Republic set up to achieve those aims? What are some of the critical institutions or bodies that may be less well known in the West? And what role do they play in Iran?
Okay, I think most important. I think most of your listeners are now by now familiar with the setup of the Islamic Republic, how the election is run, what is the Majlis, the parliament. Uh, but what they are not so much might not be aware of is the role of the office of the supreme leader, which is called the Beit Rahbari. Um, and in my estimation, it's the most important office of this political system. Indeed, most of the foreign policy decisions, economic decisions are taken within the office of the supreme leader. And the supreme leader uses it to communicate and to administer orders to various military, cultural, economic, and political organizations. And a number of political, military, and religious advisors work under this office. It has its own foreign minister. Dr. Velayati, Ali Akbar Velayati, for the longest time, has been advising the supreme leader on foreign relations. If I may also just go on a tangent, for example, up until a few years ago, uh, the government in Britain, when they wanted to negotiate for the release of either the Marines that were taken, the British Marines that were taken in Iran, they would go through the diplomatic channels. The diplomatic channels dictate that you have to go through the embassy and from the embassy to the foreign ministry in Iran. It is only later they found out that it is not actually the embassy that is the conduit or the decision maker, but the supreme leader's office that is in a mosque in Maidavale in London. And so these are this is the way that the Islamic Republic has been able to conduct its policy and foreign relations, not through conventional diplomatic channels that the international community is used to, but rather opaquely uh, through its various other bodies. Now, one Majlis parliamentarian, Ali Motahari, actually called this Beit Rahbari and its influence as being so great that the parliament is effectively a branch of the office of the supreme leader. So all decisions relating to whether the nuclear agreement, JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or whether to continue the war with Iraq or not, we're taken not by the regular branches of government, but rather through the Beit Rahbari. And interestingly, it is very complex, it is multi-layer, it has its own special advisors, and it is led by Khamenei's sons. So that is why Iran is at this juncture in a state of chaos. Decisions are being made in various areas, but at the end of the day, it is the office of the Supreme Leader and the Supreme Leader and now his sons who are responsible for setting the way forward.
And this, based on how you described it, this is not necessarily the result of factious infighting or this group against this group. I mean, this is the way that the system, the Islamic Republic itself, is set up. Correct? It endows so much power in the Supreme Leader, in the Velayat Faqih. Is that right? I mean, so much is made in the West, of every time Javad Zarif flies to Brussels or to Geneva or to New York for the United Nations, much is made of Iran's foreign minister. But based on what you're saying, this is really being decided elsewhere. And Mr. Zarif is, I don't know, merely a puppet? Or what is the function of having people like Javad Zarif, who, at least on TV, play the part of diplomat if the decisions are actually made elsewhere?
Well, as I told you, in the beginning, there were forces that came together to bring about the revolution. And these political elites have remained on the scene ever since. And they each play their own part. But let's go back to the constitution. The constitution that is governing Iran right now is not the same constitution that Mr. Khomeini was governing by. In April 1989, he appointed a 20-man assembly to revise the constitution.
And that's 20 men, right? No, all men.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. I mean, that is another important fact to understand, is that women are not allowed, are not considered to be able, as Rejal, as the elite, political elite, to be able to either run for the office of presidency, and for sure there will never be a supreme leader, a female supreme leader, as it is right now. But in 1989, Mr. Khomeini appointed a 20-man assembly to revise the constitution, and the assembly was only completed its work after Khomeini's death, and it amended the constitution in very important ways. To begin with, his allies, Mr. Khomeini's allies, and specifically like the original elite of the revolution, like Mr. Rafsanjani and them, they didn't want, they feared that the office of the supreme leader would be weakened after his death, and that the power would shift to those elected officials, those that were either Western educated or the communists, MEK. So they came, and the post in the beginning there was the supreme leader and the prime minister. So they abolished the post of prime minister, and his powers were then vested in the office of the president. Judicial authority was vested in one single individual rather than the council of 5 jurists. And because and also let me go back to the direction of national and radio television broadcasting services, rather than being under the control of a 3-man council, it was shifted to one individual appointed by the supreme leader, and at the same time a new Supreme National Security Council, which is headed by the president and includes representatives from the foreign ministry, military and security services, was created to deal with matters of internal security and external security. Because Mr. Raf, and we now know this, that Mr. Khamenei at that time did not want to be a supreme leader. He knew that he wasn't able, because he lacked the necessary religious qualifications to become supreme leader. It was Mr. Rafsanjani who actually pressured him into accepting. So at that time, the Islamic Republic, the control was divided between, on the one hand, Mr. Rafsanjani, and the other hand, Mr. Khamenei. And it was a very carefully managed arrangement, and the qualifications of the supreme leader were downgraded to allow for the post to devolve not to one of the leading Islamic jurists, but to someone like Mr. Khamenei. And so we see a shift into the Islamic Republic, but also at the same time, the powers vested in for the supreme leader were increased. So a lot of Iranians talk about that transformation as becoming from a velayat faqih to a velayat faqih mutlaq, which is a totalitarian velayat faqih, a total velayat faqih rule of jurisprudence. And that is what we have today.
Interesting. And so on, the regime, however, does make, and going back to that third faction that you referred to as being the revolutionaries, perhaps those who are Western educated, they put some components into the regime that are very frequently discussed in the West. The elections, although final decisions rest with the supreme leader, and he, as you said, is not elected by the people, but what was the word you used? Recognized? Was it by the people?
Yes, recognized by the people.
I'm not sure how that's gauged, but there are seemingly some democratic components to, or at least those that are called democratic components to the Islamic Republic system, and we talk about them a lot in the West. The Western media often talks about elections in Iran, the elections for the presidency, the elections for the parliament. We just had those a few months ago when the coronavirus crisis was rolling through Iran. But those elections are quite different from elections that you may have in Britain than those we may have in the United States. There are some hurdles, it appears, to partaking in those elections, and we don't have to get into the corrupt outcomes or 2009 and how the elections are basically stolen. But I'm interested in the run up to those elections, and I think our listeners would benefit from knowing what happens before one actually becomes a candidate in this election. And I know the Guardian Council plays a role there. What does that look like? What's the vetting process for candidates?
You mentioned the Guardian Council, and the Guardian Council plays the key role because it is constitutionally mandated 12-member council that has a lot of power and influence, and it decides on who can run for elections, whether they are good Muslims, whether they have been good citizens under the Islamic Republic, specifically whether when it comes to the election of the president, to make sure that they are men. Women can not run for the office. Elections in Iran, although, for example, women are very politically active, they cannot become presidents. But once candidates are formally allowed to run, then they can gain equal access to state media and have platforms during their campaign. But once again, the problem is that nobody can run without the approval of the Guardian Council, which itself is not only unelected, but it is firmly in the conservative camp. So while anyone can register as a candidate, only a chosen few are let through the gates. So that is the problem of the election process in Iran.
It reminds me of a quote of one of the regime insiders. This was from a few years ago. He said, we do indeed have democracy. It's just democracy between those who we decide. And it appears, based on what you said, that still holds true.
Yes, it's very true, because as long as you are within the polity, as they call it, within the system, as long as you are a khodi, you have a lot of rights. because you, first of all, you do believe in the divine right of the supreme leader to guide your life. But once you do not believe in this, are not part of this elite or polity, you do not have any right, except when it comes to election time, election period, where you are invited to go and cast your vote for accepted candidates.
And even still, where that vote goes, it's not always clear, as we've seen several
The,
times.
that's one of the problems of the election process in Iran. It's neither fair nor it's transparent. So there you go.
And
Nor is it free. Nor is it free.
Yeah. The three big problems that any election should not have, they seem to have. But you mentioned, if you're okay with the supreme leader guiding your life, if you're okay with accepting the notion that your government draws its authority not from you and your peers, but rather from God, and is indeed running the country or running the ummat in a temporary state of affairs, waiting for the hidden imam to return and take over government, you can be fine. But I know you speak very frequently, as in your role as journalist and also as an Iranian, with young people, with Iranians inside the country and those in exile. This regime has been in power for 41 years now. What do you think Iranians think about the system, about the structure of the Islamic Republic? What do you see for the future?
Well, I do see a tremendous shift at the grassroots level. I remember the revolution clearly, revolutionary times. I can easily tell you at least 90% of people around me were pro the revolution. But given 40 years later, I can only say perhaps 10% are still,
Wow.
pro-revolution and pro-Islamic Republic. Why? Because the Islamic Republic has not been able to manage the lives of Iranians in a very constructive way. It has been misplaced priorities. The priorities for, let's take, for example, the foreign policy. There are many uh, experts in the West. When they talk about and describe the foreign policy of the Islamic Republic today, they compare it to the same ambitions that were there before the revolution that Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi had, without realizing that before the revolution, it was the individual, the well-being of that citizen that was central to all the decision-making process in Iran. At the moment, it is not. It has become clear that it is not about the welfare of that citizen, but the welfare of the Islamic Republic, the continuation of the Beit Rahbari, the continuation of the Islamic Republic, not after Khamenei, not for new democracy, but rather to Khamenei's sons and those and his appointed heirs. So and Iranians have spoken through election after election. They've gone and participated in whatever form and made their voices heard, whether it be in elections or whether it be just leaving the country. Most of the youth, most of the college graduates prefer to leave Iran than to stay in Iran. That says a lot about whether they think they are shareholders in the future of a country or whether no. Once again, they will have to recognize a supreme leader that is not at the end of the day governing to their interests, but rather to the interests of the polity of the Islamic Republic state. And unfortunately, or fortunately, the state of affairs that we now see in Iran, we see many of the former revolutionaries themselves accepting that this form of government, this constitution, cannot continue as is.
Well, and it's interesting. I think so many people who for so long partook in these elections, who went and stamped their finger in ink and did so with pride, as trying to find an outlet to exercise their democratic rights, their natural rights, have now taken that right in two different forms, neither of which are within the confines of the system. One is the one you mentioned of leaving the country and this immense brain drain we have. The other is what we've seen much more clearly in the past 3 years, especially, it are these nearly consistent or constant uprisings and protests. We see them in the past few days, and I'd be interested in seeing your perspective on how those protests have shifted. I mean, some of the chants that we hear of, they've seemingly changed from "I want my vote back," which we heard in 2009, to "I want my country back." I mean, some of the chants you hear are, down with or death to the principle of Velayat Fari, down with the Islamic Republic. So that seems to be where a lot of the discourse is happening. They've sort of passed the ballot box. It's now on the street. Is that right?
You are very correct. I mean, protests in Iran have grown in size and scale and violence since its inception. Uh, in the early 1990s, we witnessed urban riots. Between 1999 and 2003, we saw student protests. And then the Movement protests in 2009 concentrated mainly at most in 10 major cities. Then in December 2017, the demonstrations that started in the holy city of Mashhad spread to about 100 cities in 48 hours. And then we had
Remarkable.
Iran's nationwide protest in November 2019, which spread across hundreds of towns and cities and left 1,500 civilians dead, killed by Iran's security apparatus. And also from 2017 onwards, the slogans have started to increasingly center on the overthrow of the Islamic Republic. And from 2019, most of the slogans we've been hearing is like the one specifically from last night. Last night there were demonstrations in Behbahan, in Khuzestan. They were saying, neither for Lebanon nor for Gaza, my life is only for Iran.
Right.
So it's the misplaced priorities of having an internationalist outlook and an expansionist outlook that has, in a way, influenced and pushed this younger generation of Iranians to say, hey, it's me, I'm Iranian, and I matter.
Wow.
My life matters.
It's amazing. And I mean, what you said, what you've taken us from the foundations of this system, the constitutional basis for this one man in the place of God rule, to the changes that the Islamic Republic has gone through, to what Iranians are saying now, has been immensely beneficial to us. I personally have learned quite a bit, and I'm really thankful for your expertise, for the time you've given us today. You are certainly a gem for all of us in the Iranian diaspora and for Iranians at home as well. Thank you so much for the time that you've given us today, Nazenin Ansari.
Thank you so much, Kamran Khan Sarinia. You're the newer generation. You're the ones, it's your generation that will hopefully make us see a better Iran.
Thank you. Hopefully, thank you for all you've done,
Thank you.
and I hope you'll join us again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.